Hello, my name is Nicholas Martin. I'm 29 years old. I work as a freelance carpenter in Portland, Oregon, and I thought I understood how life worked until the day Karen Reed grabbed my collar outside the old brick library on Southeast Morrison Street and whispered, "Look at me first." That moment changed everything I thought I knew about connection, about seeing someone truly, and about the courage it takes to be vulnerable with a stranger who somehow feels like coming home. But let me back up. Let me tell you how I got to that moment when her fingers curled around the fabric of my jacket and her voice cut through all the noise in my head with three simple words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. It started 6 months earlier on a Tuesday morning in March when the rain was doing that thing it does in Portland. Not quite drizzling, but not quite stopping either. I was sitting in Powell's Books, the big one on Burnside, nursing a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and pretending to read a book about Japanese woodworking techniques. Really, I was watching people. It's something I do when I'm stuck on a project or when my mind won't settle. I watch how strangers move through space, how they hold their shoulders, how they choose which aisle to walk down. That's when I first saw her. She was in the poetry section, running her finger along the spines of books like she was reading Braille. Her hair was this warm brown color that caught the fluorescent lights in a way that made me think of honey, and she wore a green sweater that looked soft enough to sleep in. She pulled out a slim volume, opened it to a random page, and I watched her face change as she read. Just for a second, her whole expression shifted from searching to finding, and I thought, there it is. That's what I'm looking for in my work, in my life, that moment of recognition. She bought the book and left before I worked up the nerve to say anything. I told myself it didn't matter. Portland is full of interesting people, and I'm not the kind of guy who approaches strangers in bookstores. I'm more comfortable with wood grain and measuring tape than with small talk and introductions. But I kept thinking about her, about the way she'd touch those book spines like she was greeting old friends, about how her face had lit up when she found whatever she was looking for on that page. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Sometimes the most ordinary moments turn into the stories we carry with us forever, and I have a feeling you might recognize something in this one. 2 weeks later, I was at the farmer's market on Saturday morning, buying apples from an old man who knew more about fruit than anyone had a right to. I was examining a particularly perfect Honeycrisp when I heard someone say, "Those are good, but the Braeburns are better for baking if that's what you're after." I turned around and there she was. Same green sweater, different day. Up close, I could see that her eyes were the color of moss after rain, and she had a small scar on her chin that made her face more interesting, not less. "I'm not much of a baker," I said, holding up the Honeycrisp. "More of a straight from the hand kind of guy." She smiled, and it was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. "Fair enough. I'm Karen, by the way. Karen Reed." "Nicholas Martin," I said, and we shook hands. Hers were warm and had tiny calluses on the fingertips that made me curious about what she did with them. We talked for maybe 10 minutes about apples and the weather and how the market had changed over the years. She mentioned she was a ceramicist, which explained the calluses, and I told her about carpentry, which seemed to genuinely interest her. She asked about the kind of wood I like to work with, and I found myself talking about the grain patterns in cherry wood and how satisfying it was to sand something smooth. When we parted ways, I had her phone number written on a receipt for 3 Honeycrisp apples, and she had mine on the back of a business card for her pottery studio. We started texting that afternoon. Not the kind of rapid-fire conversation that burns bright and fast, but something slower and more deliberate. She'd send me a photo of something she was working on, a bowl taking shape on her wheel, and I'd respond with a picture of a cabinet I was building, the way the light fell across the wood grain. It felt like we were showing each other how we saw the world, one image at a time. Our first real date was 3 weeks later. I picked her up at her studio, which was in an old warehouse in Southeast Portland that had been converted into artist spaces. The smell hit me first, that earthy scent of clay and water, and something indefinably creative. Her space was organized chaos, shelves lined with pieces in various stages of completion, tools arranged with the kind of precision that comes from years of practice. She was finishing up for the day, cleaning clay from under her fingernails at a deep sink. She wore jeans with holes in the knees and a flannel shirt rolled up to her elbows, and I thought she looked more beautiful covered in clay dust than most people did dressed up for special occasions. "Ready for dinner?" I asked. "Actually," she said, turning to face me with a slightly mischievous expression, "I was thinking we could cook instead, if you're up for it." She lived in a small house about 6 blocks from her studio, the kind of place that looked like it had been built in the 1920s and lovingly maintained ever since. The kitchen was tiny but efficient, with open shelving displaying mismatched dishes that I realized she'd probably made herself. We made pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market and a simple sauce that somehow tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. We talked about our families, about how we'd both ended up in Portland, about books and music and the way certain smells could transport you instantly to childhood. I learned that she'd grown up in a small town in Eastern Oregon, that her father had been a high school English teacher and her mother a librarian, that she'd come to Portland for college and never left, even when a serious relationship had ended badly 3 years earlier. She asked about my family, and I told her about growing up in suburban Seattle, about my father, the accountant, who'd never understood my need to work with my hands, about my mother, who'd supported my decision to skip college and learn carpentry through apprenticeships instead. The conversation flowed like we'd known each other for years instead of weeks. There was something about her presence that made me want to be more honest than I usually was, more open about the things that mattered to me. After dinner, we sat on her small back porch with glasses of wine, watching the sky fade from blue to purple to black. She told me about a series of bowls she was working on, inspired by the way water moves over stones in a creek bed. I found myself describing a dining table I'd been commissioned to build, how I wanted to preserve a natural edge on one side to show the tree's original shape. When I drove home that night, I felt like something had shifted in my chest, like a door had opened that I hadn't even realized was closed. We fell into a rhythm over the next few months. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market became our tradition. I'd pick her up at 9 and we'd walk through the stalls slowly, buying ingredients for whatever we decided to cook that weekend. She introduced me to vendors she'd been buying from for years, and I watched how she chose vegetables, testing the firmness of tomatoes, smelling herbs before deciding. Evenings often found us in one of our workspaces. She'd throw pots while I sanded or measured or cut, the sounds of our separate labors creating a kind of companionable symphony. Sometimes we'd work in comfortable silence, and sometimes we'd talk about whatever was on our minds. She had a way of asking questions that made me think about things differently, and I found myself looking forward to her perspective on problems I was trying to solve. It was during one of these evenings in early July that I realized I was falling in love with her. She was trimming the excess clay from a bowl, her face concentrated in that particular way she had when she was focused on getting something exactly right. The late afternoon light was coming through the warehouse windows, turning everything golden, and I looked at her hands moving with such precision and thought, this is what I want my life to look like. But I didn't say anything. I'm not good at declarations, at putting feelings into words before I'm absolutely certain they're welcome. Instead, I kept showing up, kept sharing my days with her, kept hoping she felt something similar. The first crack in our easy rhythm came in August. Karen had been quieter than usual for a few days, distracted in a way that made me wonder if I'd done something wrong. Finally, on a Thursday evening while we were cleaning up after dinner at my apartment, she said, "I need to tell you something." My stomach dropped. In my experience, conversations that start that way don't end well. She sat down at my kitchen table and looked at her hands for a long moment before speaking. "I got an offer today. A gallery in San Francisco wants to represent my work. It's a good opportunity. Maybe the best I'll ever get." "That's amazing," I said, and I meant it, even though something cold was spreading through my chest. "You should take it. It would mean moving there," she said quietly. "At least for a year, maybe longer. To really make it work, I'd need to be there full time, building relationships, doing shows." I sat down across from her, trying to keep my face neutral. "When would you go?" "If I say yes, probably in October. That gives me time to finish up my current projects and find someone to sublet my studio space." We sat in silence for a while. Outside, I could hear the sound of traffic on Division Street, the ordinary noise of a city going about its evening business, while my world rearranged itself around this new information. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. And there was something in her voice that made me look at her more carefully. I think you should follow your dreams, I said. It's what I would do. She nodded, but she looked disappointed, and I wondered if I'd given the wrong answer. But what else could I say? That I wanted her to turn down the opportunity of a lifetime to stay in Portland with a carpenter she'd known for 5 months? That felt selfish and small. We didn't talk about it again for 2 weeks. We went through the motions of our usual routine, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. She was already leaving. I could feel it, even though she hadn't made her decision yet. Then, on a Saturday morning at the farmer's market, she told me she'd accepted the gallery's offer. I'm happy for you, I said, and part of me was, but mostly I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. We agreed to spend her remaining weeks in Portland together, to make the most of the time we had left. But it was different now. Every shared meal felt like a goodbye. Every evening in our workshops felt like we were already nostalgic for something that was ending. The night before she left, we didn't sleep. We stayed up talking until dawn, lying in her bed surrounded by boxes, trying to memorize each other's voices. She told me she was scared about moving to a city where she didn't know anyone, about whether her work was really good enough for the opportunity she'd been given. I told her about projects I wanted to build, about maybe expanding my business someday, about how much I was going to miss having someone who understood why I cared so much about getting the grain pattern just right. When the sun came up, I helped her load the last of her things into a rented truck. We stood on her front porch and she handed me her house key. The new tenant won't move in for 2 weeks, she said, in case you want to come by and remember what it was like. I won't need to remember, I said. I'm not going to forget. She kissed me then, soft and din final, and I watched her drive away until the truck disappeared around the corner. The next 3 months were the longest of my life. I threw myself into work, taking on more projects than I could reasonably handle, staying in my workshop until late at night because going home to my empty apartment felt unbearable. I stopped going to the farmer's market on Saturdays. I stopped going to Powell's. I avoided all the places that reminded me of her, which turned out to be most of Portland. We texted occasionally. She sent me pictures of her new studio, of the gallery where her work was displayed, of the Golden Gate Bridge on foggy mornings. I sent her photos of projects I was working on, of the changing leaves in Laurelhurst Park, of my coffee cups sitting on the table where we used to eat breakfast together. But it wasn't the same. How could it be? She was building a new life 300 miles away, and I was stuck in the ghost of our old one. In November, she texted me that she'd sold 3 pieces in her first gallery show. I'm starting to think I might actually make it as an artist, she wrote, and I could feel her excitement even through the screen of my phone. I'm so proud of you, I replied, and I was. But I was also jealous of her courage, of her willingness to leap into uncertainty for the sake of her dreams. December came and went. I spent Christmas with my parents in Seattle, fielding questions about why I seemed so quiet, why I wasn't dating anyone, why I looked like I wasn't sleeping enough. I made excuses and changed the subject and counted the days until I could come home to Portland and my familiar loneliness. It was in January, on a particularly gray Tuesday, that everything changed again. I was at the library on Southeast Morrison, researching joinery techniques for a complicated built-in bookshelf project when I saw her. She was sitting at a table near the windows surrounded by art books and notebooks, her hair longer than it had been when she left. She wore a different green sweater, but the color was almost exactly the same as the one I'd first noticed her in at Powell's all those months ago. My first instinct was to leave, to gather my books and slip out before she noticed me. I wasn't ready for this conversation, wasn't prepared to hear about her new life and her success and how much she loved San Francisco. But as I stood up to go, she looked up from her notebook and saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled, that same sun-coming-out smile I remembered, and waved me over. "Nicholas," she said as I approached her table. "What are the odds?" I sat down across from her, my heart beating faster than it should have been. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in San Francisco." I was. "I'm visiting for a few days," she said, "taking care of some business, seeing friends." Her voice was casual, but something in her expression wasn't. "How's the gallery thing going?" I asked. "It's going well," she said. "Really well, actually. Better than I expected. But that's not why I'm here." She closed her notebook and looked at me directly, And I felt that same jolt of recognition I'd experienced watching her read poetry in Powell's almost a year earlier. I made a mistake, she said, when I left. Not about taking the opportunity, that was the right thing to do, but about how I left, about what I didn't say. I waited for her to continue, afraid to interrupt whatever she was trying to tell me. I've been thinking about you constantly, she said, about us, about what we had and what we might have had if I'd been braver. You were brave, I said. You moved to a new city to follow your dreams. That takes courage. That's not the kind of brave I mean, she said. I mean brave enough to ask you to come with me. Brave enough to admit that I was falling in love with you and that leaving felt like tearing myself in half. The words hung between us in the quiet library air. I could hear the sound of pages turning, of keyboards clicking, of the ordinary world continuing around us while mine shifted on its axis again. I was falling in love with you too, I said. I wanted to ask you to stay, but it felt selfish. We both made the same mistake, she said with a sad smile. We protected each other from choices we thought we couldn't ask each other to make. So what now? I asked. Now I'm asking, she said. The gallery wants to extend my contract for another year, and I want to say yes. But I also want to know if you'd consider moving to San Francisco with me. Not to give up your work, but to see if we can build something together in a new place. I stared at her, trying to process what she was asking. Leave Portland? Leave the city I'd called home for 7 years? The network of clients I'd spent years building? The workshop where I'd learned to trust my hands and my instincts? I know it's a lot to ask, she said quickly. I know you have a life here, a business. But there are carpenters in San Francisco too, and people who need beautiful things built. And I think maybe we could figure it out together if we wanted to badly enough. I thought about the last 3 months, about how empty everything had felt without her, about Saturday mornings that didn't include the farmer's market, about evenings in my workshop that felt hollow without the sound of her voice, about lying awake at night wondering what she was doing, who she was talking to, whether she ever missed the rhythm we'd found together. Can I think about it? I asked. Of course, she said. I'm here until Sunday. That gives you 4 days. We spent the next hour catching up on the details of our separate lives. She told me about her apartment in the Mission District, about the artists she'd met, about how different the light was in California and how it was changing her work. I told her about projects I'd finished, about a commission for a restaurant that had led to 3 more jobs, about how I'd started teaching weekend workshops for people who wanted to learn basic woodworking skills. When we finally left the library, the winter sun was setting, turning the sky the color of salmon. We walked to her rental car in comfortable silence, and when we reached it, she turned to face me. Whatever you decide, she said, I'm glad I saw you today. I'm glad I got to tell you what I should have said before I left. I'm glad too, I said. She got in the car and rolled down the window. I'll be at my old studio tomorrow afternoon, if you want to talk more, cleaning out the last of my things. I nodded and watched her drive away, just like I had 3 months earlier. But this time felt different. This time felt like a beginning instead of an ending. That night, I called my friend Stephen Clark, who'd been my closest friend since we'd worked together on a renovation project 4 years earlier. He was a contractor with a practical mind and a good heart, and I trusted his judgment more than almost anyone's. So let me get this straight, he said after I'd explained the situation. The woman you've been moping about for 3 months wants you to move to San Francisco with her. I haven't been moping, I said. You've been moping, he said. It's been painful to watch. The question is, what do you want to do? I don't know, I said. It's complicated. No, it's not, he said. You're making it complicated. Do you love her? Yes. Do you want to be with her? Yes. Then what's the problem? The problem is I'd be giving up everything I've built here. My business, my workshop, my life. You'd be trading one life for another life, he said. And from where I sit, the new life sounds a lot better than the one you've been living since she left. We talked for another hour, and by the time I hung up, I knew what I wanted to do. The question was whether I had the courage to do it. The next day, I drove to her old studio. The warehouse felt different, emptier somehow, even though most of the other artists were still there. Her space had been cleared out except for a few boxes and the pottery wheel, which she was cleaning with the same careful attention she'd always given her tools. I've been thinking about what you said, I told her. She looked up from the wheel, her hands still dusty with clay. And? And I think you're right. I think we made the same mistake. I think we were both so busy trying to be unselfish that we forgot to be honest about what we wanted. What do you want? She asked. I want to be with you, I said. I want to see what we can build together. I want to wake up next to you and make Saturday morning coffee and watch you work and show you the things I'm making. I want all of it. She stood up and walked over to me, her face serious. It won't be easy, she said, starting over in a new place, figuring out how to make it work. I know, I said, but I think it'll be worth it. She reached up and touched my face, her clay-dusty fingers cool against my skin. I think so too, she said. We spent the rest of the afternoon making plans. I would finish up my current projects in Portland, which would take about 6 weeks. She would go back to San Francisco and start looking for workshop space I could rent, maybe in the same building as her studio, if there was room. We would figure out the practical details as we went, but the important decision was made. That evening, we had dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our second date, a tiny Vietnamese place with mismatched chairs and the best pho in the city. We talked about San Francisco, about what it would be like to explore a new place together, about the kinds of projects I might find there. After dinner, we walked through the neighborhood where she used to live, past the house with the tiny kitchen where we'd cooked so many meals together. It was dark, but I could see lights on in the windows, and I wondered about the people who lived there now, whether they were happy, whether they appreciated the way the morning light came through the east-facing windows. We ended up at my apartment, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel lonely there. We sat on my couch with glasses of wine, and she told me more about her life in San Francisco, about the friends she'd made, about the way the fog rolled in from the ocean every afternoon. I'm scared, she admitted as we were getting ready for bed. What if we get there and it doesn't work? What if we're better apart than we are together? What if we're better together than we ever imagined? I said. What if this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing? She left the next morning to fly back to San Francisco, but this time it felt different. This time we had a plan, a future we were building together instead of separate paths leading away from each other. The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of activity. I finished the restaurant commission and 2 smaller projects, sold most of my furniture, and gave notice on my apartment lease. I researched neighborhoods in San Francisco, looking at workshop spaces and apartments, trying to imagine what our life there might look like. Karen and I talked every day, sometimes for hours. She found a space in her building that might work for a woodworking shop and sent me photos and measurements. I started making lists of tools I'd need to replace, of suppliers I'd need to find, of the 1,000 practical details involved in relocating a business. My parents were surprised but supportive when I told them about the move. My father, who'd never understood my career choice, seemed to respect the fact that I was willing to take a risk for love. My mother cried and said she was proud of me for being brave enough to follow my heart. Stephen helped me pack up my workshop, carefully wrapping my hand tools and disassembling my workbench. As we loaded everything into a rented truck, he said, "You know you're doing the right thing, don't you?" "I hope so," I said. "I know so," he said. "I've never seen you as happy as you were when you were with her, and I've never seen you as miserable as you've been since she left." The drive to San Francisco took 8 hours, and I spent most of it thinking about what I was leaving behind and what I was driving toward. I thought about the first time I'd seen Karen in Powell's, about the way she'd touch those book spines like she was reading Braille. I thought about Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, about the sound of her pottery wheel spinning while I worked at my bench. I thought about the conversation we'd had at the library, about the courage it had taken for her to ask me to come with her, and about the courage it was taking for me to say yes. When I finally reached San Francisco, the sun was setting over the bay, and the city looked like something out of a dream. Karen met me at her apartment, and when I saw her standing on the sidewalk waiting for me, I knew I'd made the right choice. "Welcome home," she said, and kissed me like she meant it. The next few months were challenging in ways I hadn't anticipated. Setting up a new workshop, finding clients, learning to navigate a new city, figuring out how to live together after months of separation. There were days when I wondered if we'd made a mistake, when the practical difficulties seemed overwhelming. But there were also mornings when I woke up next to her and remembered why I'd come. There were evenings when we'd work side by side in our respective studios, the familiar rhythm of our separate labors, creating something that felt like harmony. There were Saturday mornings when we'd explore new neighborhoods together, finding farmers markets and bookstores and coffee shops that might become our new traditions. Slowly, San Francisco began to feel like home. I found clients who appreciated craftsmanship, who were willing to pay for furniture that was built to last. Karen's work continued to flourish, and I loved watching her confidence grow as she realized she could succeed anywhere. 6 months after I'd moved to San Francisco, we were walking through Golden Gate Park on a Sunday afternoon when Karen stopped suddenly and grabbed my arm. "What is it?" I asked. "Look," she said, pointing to a couple sitting on a bench nearby. They were elderly, probably in their 70s, and they were reading the Sunday paper together. The woman was reading the arts section while the man worked on the crossword puzzle, and every few minutes one of them would share something interesting with the other. "That's what I want," Karen said. 50 years from now, I want to be sitting on a bench with you, reading the paper and sharing the interesting bits." I looked at the couple, at the easy intimacy of their shared silence, at the way they leaned into each other without thinking about it. "I want that too," I said. That night, I started planning. Not a grand gesture or an elaborate proposal, but something that would capture what we built together and what we hope to build in the future. I spent weeks designing and crafting a small wooden box, inlaid with a pattern inspired by the grain of the cherry wood I told her about on our first date at the farmer's market. Inside, I planned to put a simple ring and a note asking her to marry me. But before I could finish the box, before I could figure out the right words for the note, something happened that changed everything again. It was a Thursday evening in late October, almost exactly a year since she'd first left Portland. We were in our respective studios working on our separate projects when Karen suddenly stood up from her pottery wheel and said, "I need to tell you something." My hand stilled on the piece of walnut I was sanding. The tone of her voice was the same one she'd used when she told me about the gallery offer, and my stomach dropped in the same way. "What is it?" I asked. "I got another offer today," she said, "from a gallery in New York. They want to give me a solo show, and if it goes well, they want to represent me exclusively." I set down my sandpaper and turned to face her. "That's incredible," I said. "New York is the big leagues." "It is," she said. "It's everything I've dreamed of since I started making pottery. But it would mean moving again, and I don't know if I can ask you to do that." I walked over to where she was standing, her hands still dusty with clay, her face uncertain. "Are you asking?" I said. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know what I'm asking. I don't know what the right thing to do is." "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to take it," she said. "I want to go to New York and see how far I can push my work, how much I can grow as an artist. But I also want to stay here with you and keep building the life we've started." We stood there looking at each other, and I could see the same conflict in her eyes that I'd felt when she'd first asked me to come to San Francisco. The pull between safety and possibility, between love and ambition. "When would you need to decide?" I asked. "They want an answer by Monday," she said. "The show would be in February, so I'd need to move by January to have time to prepare." "That gives us 3 days," I said. 3 days to decide the rest of our lives," she said with a shaky laugh. We spent Friday walking around the city, visiting all the places that had become meaningful to us over the past 6 months. The coffee shop where we'd had breakfast on my first morning in San Francisco. The bookstore in the Mission where we'd discovered we both loved the same obscure poetry. The bench in Dolores Park where we'd sat and watched the fog roll in from the ocean. We didn't talk much about the decision. Instead, we just tried to be present with each other, to remember what we'd built and what we might be leaving behind. Saturday morning, we drove up to Muir Woods and walked among the redwoods, those ancient trees that had been growing for centuries before we were born and would continue growing long after we were gone. There was something about their permanence that put our human-sized problems into perspective. As we walked, Karen told me about her dreams for the New York show, about the series of pieces she wanted to create, about how scared and excited she was about the possibility of working with a gallery that could launch her career nationally. I told her about the woodworking community I'd started to build in San Francisco, about the clients who were beginning to trust me with their most important projects, about how much I'd grown to love the city and the life we'd created there. But I also told her about the dreams I'd had before I'd met her, about maybe expanding my business someday, about teaching and writing about woodworking, about projects I wanted to build that would outlast my lifetime. That evening, we cooked dinner together in her tiny kitchen, the same kind of simple meal we'd made on our first date in Portland. As we ate, we talked about what it would mean to start over again, to build something new in yet another city. I keep thinking about that couple in the park, Karen said, the ones reading the newspaper together. I want that with you, but I also want to know that I pushed my art as far as it could go, that I didn't settle for less than I was capable of. I want that too, I said. Both things, the newspaper and the pushing. So what do we do? She asked. Sunday morning, I woke up with an idea. It was risky and impractical and probably crazy, but it felt right in a way that surprised me. I found Karen in the kitchen, making coffee and staring out the window at the fog-covered city. I've been thinking, I said, about New York and about us and about what we both want. She turned to look at me, and I could see the exhaustion in her face from a night of not sleeping. What if we both went? I said. What if we treated this like an adventure instead of a problem? You mean move to New York together? She asked. I mean move to New York together and see what happens. You take the gallery offer and I figure out how to make woodworking work there. It's not like there's a shortage of people who need furniture in New York City. She stared at me for a long moment. You'd do that? She asked. Pick up and move again, start over again just because I got offered a show? I'd do that because I love you, I said. Because I want to see what you can accomplish when you're not holding yourself back. Because I think we're better together than apart, no matter what city we're in. She set down her coffee cup and walked over to me, and I could see tears in her eyes. But what about your business here? She asked. What about the life we've built? We'll build another one, I said. We're good at that, apparently. She laughed, and it was the first time she'd sounded truly happy since she'd gotten the call about New York. You're crazy, she said. Probably, I said, but I'm crazy about you, and I think that's worth something. That afternoon, she called the gallery and accepted their offer. I started making lists again, researching neighborhoods and workshop spaces, figuring out the logistics of another cross-country move. This time, though, it felt different. This time we were choosing together, making a decision based on what we both wanted rather than what we thought we should want. The next few months passed quickly. We sold our leases in San Francisco and packed up our lives once again. This time, Stephen flew out to help us, and he spent the weekend making jokes about how we were becoming professional nomads. You know, this is the last time I'm helping you move, right? He said as we loaded the truck. This is the last time, I promised. After New York, we're settling down somewhere and staying put. Famous last words, Karen said, but she was smiling. The drive to New York took 4 days, and we stopped in places we'd never seen before. Small towns in Nevada and Colorado and Kansas, roadside diners and motels with neon signs, and views of landscapes that seemed to go on forever. It felt like a honeymoon, even though we weren't married yet. On our last night on the road, somewhere in Pennsylvania, we sat outside our motel room and looked up at more stars than you could ever see in a city. Are you scared? Karen asked. Terrified, I said. You? Same, she said, but also excited, like we're about to start the real adventure. When we finally reached New York, the city was everything I'd expected and nothing I was prepared for. The noise and the energy and the sheer scale of it all was overwhelming, but there was also something thrilling about being part of something so much larger than ourselves. We found an apartment in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood full of artists and makers and people who were chasing their own versions of the dream. Karen's studio was in Manhattan, in a building that smelled like turpentine and ambition. I found workshop space in Queens, in an old warehouse that reminded me of her first studio in Portland. The transition was harder than San Francisco had been. New York was more expensive, more competitive, more demanding. There were days when I wondered if we'd bitten off more than we could chew. But there were also moments of pure magic. The opening night of Karen's show in February, when I watched her stand next to her work and talk to collectors and critics about the ideas behind each piece. The first time a client in New York commissioned a piece from me based on a recommendation from someone who'd seen my work. The Saturday morning when we discovered a farmer's market in Brooklyn that reminded us of the one in Portland, and we bought apples from a vendor who knew as much about fruit as anyone had a right to. 6 months into our New York adventure, we were walking home from dinner in our neighborhood when Karen suddenly stopped and grabbed my collar, just like she had outside the library in Portland all those months ago. Look at me first, she said, the same words she'd whispered that day when everything had changed. I looked at her, really looked, and I saw everything we'd been through together. The first meeting in Powell's, the farmers' market conversations, the Saturday mornings and quiet evenings, the courage to leave Portland, the fear and excitement of San Francisco, the leap of faith that had brought us here. I see you, I said. I see you too, she said, and I want to keep seeing you in every city we end up in, for as long as you'll let me. That night, I gave her the wooden box I'd been working on for months, the one with the cherry wood inlay and the simple ring inside. I didn't get down on one knee or make a speech. I just handed it to her and said, "Will you marry me?" She opened the box and looked at the ring, at the pattern in the wood that told the story of our beginning. "Yes," she said, "in every city, in every life we build together, yes." We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony in Prospect Park with Stephen as my best man and Karen's sister, Christina, as her maid of honor. We wrote our own vows, and I promised to follow her dreams wherever they led us, and she promised to build a life with me that honored both of our ambitions. Now, 2 years later, we're still in New York. Karen's career has taken off in ways she never imagined, and I've built a client base of people who appreciate the kind of work I do. We have a routine again, Saturday mornings at the farmers market, evenings in our respective studios. The comfortable rhythm of two people who've learned how to be together without losing themselves. Sometimes I think about that moment outside the library in Portland, when she grabbed my collar and whispered those 3 words that changed everything. "Look at me first." It seems like such a simple request, but it was really asking for everything. To be seen, to be known, to be chosen despite all the uncertainty and risk. That's what love is, I think. The willingness to look at someone, really look, and say yes to all of it. The dreams and the fears, the staying and the leaving, the building and the rebuilding. It's saying yes to the person and yes to the adventure, even when you don't know where it will lead. And if you're watching this and wondering if you have the courage to grab someone's collar and ask them to really see you, or to follow someone to a new city, or to start over again in pursuit of something better, I want you to know that it's worth it. The risk is worth it. The fear is worth it. Love is worth it. Because at the end of the day, we're all just looking for someone who will see us clearly and choose us anyway. Someone who will build a life with us that's bigger than either of us could create alone. And when you find that person, when they grab your collar and whisper, "Look at me first," the only answer is yes.